You are looking live. So your title, once again, his voice trumps yours. Your title for your notes that you're not going to take much of today, at least we'll get started with the Great Depression, the 1930s. From the roaring 20s to the Great Depression, all hinged on one of those times in history that's like really convenient hinge. You know what I'm saying by hinge? Like you had the roaring 20s, and just about at the end of the 20s, the end of October, so only 2 months from the end of 1929, you have this pivotal point with the stock market crash that sends us into another decade that is going to be dominated by this thing we call the Great Depression. You know, like history doesn't usually pay attention to, not that it did in this case, to dates and having things nice and neat like 20s, 30s, right? It doesn't happen that way. This is one of the rare cases that it does. And I feel my all the shoveling I did, yes, the old-fashioned way, by myself. You laugh. I'm on the backside of 50, Caleb. I did all that shoveling by myself. And I feel in my voice that I'm still worn out from that. Chase wasn't home. The crash. Remember Black Tuesday? Black Tuesday followed Black Thursday. So October 24th, 1929, much to the dismay of almost all investors, they noticed when the market opened on that Thursday, hey, what's going on here? We have a lot of people selling. Where's all the buyers? For years, we've had this constant market of buyers willing to buy more and more and more. And on that Thursday, there was a pretty steep drop off in people wanting to buy. And we talked a little bit about it led to closing the stock market. It led to closing banks. It led to people starting to panic. It led to the people, the big bankers trying to steady things after closing it. And then they reopened on Tuesday, Black Tuesday the 29th, and there was no stopping it. The bottom falls out. And people that thought they had millions, literally in the 20s, millions would have been way more than today, right? Found out that they really have nothing. Devastated people's lives economically, devastated people's lives mentally, spiritually. People ended their own lives, literally, because of what happened to them in such a quick span of time. So this video is going to take us a little rehashing of the 20s as we head to the 30s. That was a lot of notes. Thank you.
America was a lot like
Anybody ever heard of Wall Street? Yeah. Who's never heard of Wall Street? Never heard of Wall Street. John, Wall Street is it's where the New York Stock Exchange is. So it's one of the most well-known streets in all the world. It's in New York, and it's where all the trading goes on that you hear about in the stock market. Make sense? Wall Street.
In 1929, years of booming prosperity ended in catastrophe. It was the biggest stock market crash since records began.
it is impossible to underestimate the shock, a sense of stunned disbelief.
First-time investors borrowed huge amounts of money to speculate on the market.
The market broke very sharply, and a lot of people were wiped out with it. It was very painful.
Later, thousands of banks failed. Millions lost everything.
The poverty was really all around us. It was really, really pitiful.
The crash was followed by a depression that spread across the world, lasted for a decade, and was a prelude to war. This is the story of a financial disaster that we hoped would never happen again.
Don't press that skip ad button. I can guarantee it will be the biggest financial mistake of your life. My name is Louis Navalier, and I'm a member of America's 1%. I manage over $1 billion for America's wealthiest elites. But I didn't create this video for my rich clients.
Wednesday, 23rd of October, 1929. Without warning, share prices are plummeting on the New York Stock Exchange. Investors are stunned. For the last 5 years, the market has only gone up. In the space of an hour, a staggering 2.5 million shares are sold. The next day, the downward spiral continues.
As people came in to trade stocks on October 24th, there was a sense that maybe something had changed, that there was something different. All of a sudden, there just weren't buyers. People were willing to sell, but there weren't buyers coming forth to buy the stocks. And prices began to fall, $2, $4, $10 a share. It was sort of horrifying.
That morning, there were drops on the stock exchange. It was so sharp and so dire. Stocks suddenly dropping 10, 20, 30 points at a time, that it said that there were shrieks and gasps in the gallery of the New York Stock Exchange.
People were stunned by what is happening and terrified. Thousands of people begin to gather outside the stock market. 10,000 people. They fill the streets from Broadway to the East River.
People wanted to know what was going on. They went there. These huge crowds gathered around the stock exchange, around the statues and on the stairs, waiting to get any kind of news they could as people came out of the exchange. They could hear voices. They could actually hear the shouting and yelling as people were buying and selling. But they didn't know what.
Sounds crazy, but remember what we said when we did the 20s, that why would like tens of thousands of people show up? Like what would, because the news trickles out and they didn't have news like they do today, like on demand click, right? You find out anything going on in the world, but you had all of these regular, normal people that were now invested in the stock market. They weren't privy to all this information. You know, they would have a stockbroker, they'd be buying the stocks. So all of a sudden you hear on the street, hey, the stock market's plunging. So you go rushing wherever you're at in New York to Wall Street to it's like a big event to find out what's going on, because maybe you've got a lot of your money tied up in this and you're not rich, but you're trying to become rich because that's the 20s, right? To learn to invest and to take the stories you hear about a guy that invested a little bit and became rich. That's what a lot of people are trying to do. So you literally have 10,000 people swarming to the New York Stock Exchange trying to get a glimpse of the news.
What was going on? And so they gathered and they stayed there to find out.
Few of the thousands waiting in the crowd appreciated the scale of the disaster that was about to unfold. Nor could they imagine that over the next 5 days, a financial catastrophe would sweep away the foundations of America's prosperity. But to understand what brought about the crash, we need to go back a decade, to a time when American confidence grew so high that it seemed the good times would last forever. In 1919, the US had emerged victorious from World War I. A note of optimism was in the air. Britain and its European allies were exhausted financially from the war. The US economy was thriving, and the world danced to the American tune. The uncertainties were over. There seemed little doubt about what was going to happen. America was going on the greatest, gaudiest spree in history, and there was going to be plenty to tell about it. In the 1920s, everyday life was changing. Electrification transformed America. Towns were hooked up to the grid. New technologies emerged. Airplanes, radios, domestic goods that had started life as luxuries now became necessities. The car industry also boomed as people flocked to buy one of the new Ford or Chrysler automobiles. An era of boundless prosperity seemed to have begun.
This is the flowering of consumer culture and mass consumption on a scale never before seen. There was also heavy installment buying to encourage people to buy big ticket consumer items so that they can buy those items on credit.
This type of consumer credit was another innovation of the 1920s. For the first time, the idea of buy now, pay later hit the mainstream.
And there's a kind of play culture that develops alongside this consumerism, which says, we believe now in instant gratification. Take care of the now. Don't worry about the future. Live for the moment.
There was a whole ideology that we were in a new economic era, that it was the birthright of every self-respecting American to be rich.
With easy credit and more disposable income, Americans were now looking for new ways to get even richer. Since World War I, the US government had sold bonds, known as Liberty Bonds, to pay for the war. This was a way to borrow money from the public, who in turn would receive interest payments on the bond's value. Celebrities such as Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks had been recruited to promote them at huge rallies.
Liberty bonds caused many people to become investors in securities for the first time. For the first time in their lives, they got interest payments every 6 months, and the security was something they could trade on the market, so they could look in the newspaper and see what the price of my bond is today.
Liberty bonds created an investing culture. Most people had never purchased securities before, and it got ordinary people accustomed to buying securities.
Now there was another group of people who thought they could take advantage of this new investing culture. The bankers of Wall Street. For years, Wall Street, the center of American finance, was made up of a small elite group of bankers doing business with each other in a society closed off to the general public.
Same time next week?
You got it.
Cool.
Let's go! But one man saw an opportunity that would change the face of the financial world. Charles Mitchell, president of National City Bank, spotted a lucrative gap in the market.
Mitchell saw that the investors had purchased a lot of government bonds during World War I. And so he said, now we have an investing public there. All we need to do is market other products like corporate bonds, common stocks, and just tell people these are respectable investments.
Mitchell was a natural salesman with a big ambition. If people were willing to buy bonds to raise capital for the government, surely they could be tempted to buy stocks and shares to raise capital for private companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And they could make a profit for themselves in the process.
Gradually, people who never dreamed that they would invest in stocks were doing so when stocks lost a lot of the stigma. Historically, stocks have been considered much too risky for ordinary people. Whereas in the 1920s, there was a sense that investing in stocks was not only safe, but reliable and respectable.
The idea took off, and to exploit this lucrative new market, Mitchell opened brokerage offices all across the country, where people who had the money but not the investment know-how could speculate in stocks and shares.
this speculative frenzy embraced all kinds of people, not just professionals. Ordinary people began participating as well in unprecedented numbers all across the country, not just New York City, but in cities and small towns all across America. People were in love with the stock market.
Technology made it all possible. The latest share prices flashed from Wall Street could be printed out within minutes across America using telegraphic ticker tape machines.
You could find ticker tape in nightclubs, in railroad depots, in beauty parlors, on ocean liners. The market became a pervasive part of America's play culture in the 1920s.
I eat, sleep, dream, talk stocks. The only way I believe to make money is in
So why do we study history? Right? So we've said that quote how many times? Those who do not remember the past are destined, doomed to repeat it. So if the price of stocks keeps rising only on that idea of speculation, only on the idea that, hey, they just keep going up, and people keep getting involved in the stock market because they believe things will just continue to go up no matter what. They don't know all the ins and outs of it, but hey, it just seems to keep going up. Could the 2020s happen just like they did in the 1920s if we're not careful? Yeah. So anyway, people are getting involved. You're going to find out that they're not only buying stocks with maybe a little bit of extra money they have. We talked about this a little bit. They start borrowing money to buy stocks. Kind of like the people that got involved, they said it used to be just like a bankers club, right? The people that were investing on Wall Street in the stock market were the rich people. Well, now common people are doing it. Kind of reminds me of something called day traders today, right? You've got a lot of people that are just like, hey, I'm just going to spend my whole day like that guy said. He eats, drinks, sleeps, stock market. That's all they do. And again, that's not necessarily bad. Just so we learn from what happened in the 20s doesn't happen in the 20s.
exciting. I love it. $17,000 profit on $3,500 capital.
Who wouldn't want that?
There were wild speculations in all kinds of securities. Movie company stocks, aeronautical stocks, all the auto company stocks.
One of the hot stocks of the 1920s was Radio Corporation of America. It was a lot like today's Google. You know, it was cutting edge technology. They had this idea that you could put radios in cars. Imagine that.
The American investing public began to connect the products they were using that were coming from corporate America with the.
Imagine if you were one of the first investors in Google. There's people out there like that. They bought Google right when it came out. Billionaires, right? Someone said Shaq did that. Anybody know that story? Shaquille O'Neal. Anyway. So it sounds like a little thing, right? You invest in this company called RCA. And they start putting radios in cars. Whoa. Cars have exploded as everybody's buying an automobile, right? And now you're the first one to invest in this company, this radio company that's putting radios in all of these cars. Why can't I get in on something like that?
The notion that, hey, I might own a share of the company that makes that product that I like.
By the mid-20s, around 3 million Americans were in the market, and Wall Street gripped the public imagination. With tales of fortunes being made overnight, the idea of a great bull market, where shares always seemed to go up, took hold.
Every popular magazine, every newspaper, every radio station was fascinated by what was going on in the stock market. People charted the activities of celebrities like Charlie Chaplin or Groucho Marx and were fascinated by what stocks they happened to be speculating in.
The young comic actor Groucho Marx invested all his savings into the market and was so pleased with his profits on paper that he persuaded his brothers to invest too.
What an easy racket. RCA went up 7 points since this morning. I just made myself $7,000.
Not a bad day.
But it wasn't just celebrities becoming speculators. The big Wall Street speculators were becoming celebrities themselves. They were thought of as creative, entrepreneurial, and bringing wealth to America. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future President Kennedy, was one of this new breed of shrewd financial superstar.
People were fascinated because some of these men, like Joseph Kennedy, were ordinary folks. They were men from nowhere. And their rapid rise on the market was a kind of inspiration to ordinary folk that might even be possible for them someday.
That anyone from bellboys to Bartons could make easy. A shoeshine boy on Wall Street, Pat Bologna was one of those by these tales of rags to riches.
Everyone is going to make a fortune. If you lived in New York, the stock market was king. My father was probably about 17 or 18. On a daily basis, he would shine the shoes of literally of the great men of America. People like Joseph Kennedy, executives like Mitchell. He would converse with them and became sort of an expert on things like the Federal Reserve and the things that you wouldn't think that a shoeshine would be expert on. But he was talking to the great minds of Wall Street every day, all day. And so my father began to invest in the stock market. If the truth be told, I learned how to reading the stock pages. Because that was what my father did. I mean, we grew up with the stock market. There was the stock market for breakfast. There was the stock market for dinner when he came home. The stock market was the world.
Guess we can stop there. Questions, comments? You've all heard of JFK, John F. Kennedy. Well, now you know where the story starts. Story starts with his father becoming an investor in the 20s. Did you guys have Mrs. Kangemi?
Yes.
I can't remember when she left. Do you guys remember Pastor Kangemi with the candy when he used to come? Always go candy to. And now he's giving out. How much money did he give out?
$27.
What?
Wait, what?
Were you sleeping during chapel?
I thought they were $1.
What was that? That was better than candy.
I just assumed they were $1. They were 10.
Crazy.
I should have said I wouldn't go to I've been browsing houses in Florida. I mean, one would have been.
Hey, with Liberty Mutual.
Which guy?